Will City. Self-care Sunday. Yo. I'm like self-care on Sundays with a day off on Monday. Private jet on the runway, taking off, going one way to the top. Whoa. Who said the sky is the limit when I'm high is my vision? On Facebook Live, going live in a minute. Don't mind me, I'm just minding my business. Breaking news, doing interviews, but it's not about me, I'm doing this for you. Matter of fact, no, I'm doing this for proof that the self-care Sundays and dreams come true. They really do.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of the Self-Care Sundays podcast. We're excited for this week's guest, Carolina. But before we get started, I wanted to ask for your help supporting the podcast via Patreon. Patreon allows supporters of the show to donate a monthly amount to help with our costs, including monthly maintenance fees, and to pay our audio engineer. We'd also like to raise enough money to hire a transcription service to make our episodes more accessible to everyone. If you'd like to help us out, please check out patreon.com/Self-Care Sundays podcast. That's patreon.com/Self-Care Sundays podcast. Thank you in advance. It's the generosity of our listeners that helps this information be accessible to so many people in the first place. Let's get started. How are you doing?
I am great. I am saying hello all the way from the Dominican Republic, from the city of Santo Domingo.
Oh, that's so exciting. How long have you been in the Dominican Republic?
Well, I was born here, and then I left to Boston when I was 4 years old, or more, they took me to Boston when I was 4 years old. And then I came back for the very first time when I was 21 years old. And then after graduating college in 2009, I decided to come back and live here, and I've been here ever since. So this is my my 9th year anniversary this summer in this country, which is kind of wild.
Yeah. So I was hoping you could start by talking us through a typical day and telling us where and how self-care plays a role.
You know, it's a shame in a way because I feel like I need to step my self-care game all the way up. I've been slacking on it a little bit, but I still try to get in at least 5 minutes of something during my day. One of the things that really helps me is my morning routine. So breakfast is super important for me, and I try to take some time in the morning to prepare myself something delicious and something hearty. Usually my days are crazy, and by feeding myself something healthy and something that's going to sustain me throughout the day, I feel like I'm definitely taking care of myself. So for me, it starts in the morning. Still not all the way there with my meditation game, but I'm trying. But I just started back on my training, my CrossFit training in the mornings too. And I feel just like my morning routines are super important to set the tone for my day and to tell myself that I'm important by taking care of my body and by taking care of my mental health from the very moment I get up in the morning.
Yeah, so you mentioned making great breakfast, CrossFit, and meditation. How did you come to find those habits? How did you learn that they worked for you? Why did you kind of start doing them?
So I've been doing lots of different exercises since high school. The elliptical, I tried running. I really suck at it. I've done everything. And finally in like 2013, I discovered the kettlebells, which is this weight that looks like a bell. And I fell in love with them. And there's something about the kettlebell that makes me feel very powerful. So I've been using them since 2013. And by training with them, I'm not a full out CrossFitter, but kettlebells technically are part of CrossFit training. But by training with the kettlebells, it just builds my resistance and I feel very strong. So after trying so many different exercises, I finally was able to find something that really helps me get into shape, but also feel like I can do anything. And that's how I bumped into that one. In terms of meditation, I have to say I'm not the best. I still have to work a lot on my meditation skills. I tend to start my meditation practice and then kind of go off somewhere. Quieting the mind for me is still a very tough thing, but I continue to try different things and I'm not giving up on my meditation at all. And then finally, in terms of nutrition, when I went to college in 2005, I discovered just all these different foods, all these different plant-based foods that I fell in love with. I grew up in a low-income household, and it's funny, I recently found a meme, whatever, on what low-income families used to eat, and that's what I used to eat. I used to eat ramen noodles, white bread with yellow cheese and hot dogs, just really crappy food. And in college, I discovered all this plant-based food that really made me feel good. So I've been trying to eat plant-based ever since. And of course, I have my days where I eat my junk and I eat my fried stuff. But just the way I feel when when I feed my body good stuff, it just makes me feel like I care about myself.
Yeah, it's so interesting the way that kind of how we eat, what we do really informs the way we feel about ourselves. I think it's not always obvious to people that that's the case. Can you talk about, you mentioned kind of growing up in a low income family. Can you talk some more about how your identity informs your self-care habits?
Yeah, so I grew up in a household full of very, very toxic behaviors, from drug use to not really prioritizing education. And I would like to think that I'm an exception to the rule. I don't think that my life story or the way that I live my life now is necessarily the way it happens for everyone. I was really, really, really lucky to find all these mentors throughout high school and throughout college who really helped me stay focused and create goals and push me to be where I am today. But definitely it was really tough, because I knew from being surrounded by folks at school and in high school particularly, and my mentors, that there was something beyond the experiences that I was living within my household. And I was always seeking to try those experiences out. So I grew up in Somerville, and Somerville is the house of Tufts University and Harvard University. So that was also my surroundings when I was growing up. And I was really lucky, because amidst the fact that I grew up in a household full of toxicity, I was in a neighborhood with a lot of really cool things happening all the time. However, I would like to say that growing up in the household that I grew up in definitely shaped the woman that I became, and the woman that I'm constantly becoming, just because being in there and having to get good grades and enter honors and AP courses when your mom didn't even know what that meant, definitely built this level of resilience in me that I don't think I would otherwise have built without living everything that I lived as a child and as an adolescent. So all of my life experiences within all of the struggles and all of the different barriers and different challenges that I faced growing up absolutely shaped the woman that I am today. And it's like, if I was able to overcome those things, I almost feel like I can overcome anything. And as an entrepreneur, I'm facing so many other challenges, and it's not easy. So being able to have gone through all the stuff that I went through as a teenager and as a child, I feel like I'm built for this, So I'm definitely grateful for everything I went through. I mean, not that I would wish it on anyone else, but it's definitely, I'm not a victim to my upbringing, and by no means.
Yeah. Well, I think what you're really talking about here is resiliency, and the idea of how challenging circumstances can cultivate resiliency and make you feel like you have all the tools you need to overcome things because you've already done it once.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So how do you navigate the Dominican-American identity while being in the DR? I'm interested in kind of your conception of belonging, because you've lived in both countries for years.
Yeah, it's so interesting how that continues to develop. So when I was in the US, I was able to keep my Spanish because my mom spoke Spanish at home. And, I learned how to cook when I was 9 years old, and I cooked Dominican food, and I loved listening to like bachata. And, I always had this sort of idea of what it was like here, because I love the beach in Boston and where I grew up. And so I had a little bit of a connection to my culture here, but not a whole lot. And I always grew up in the US sort of longing to come back and to live something different here that connected me more to who I was. So I always had that longing. I always had that nostalgia. Even though I left here when I was 4, in my head, I had all these like either fake memories or like constructed memories of what my grandmother and my mom used to say that I used to do here until I was 4. So I always had that nostalgia, but I didn't necessarily feel all the way like Dominican, right? And I just didn't necessarily feel like African American or fully Black. And then obviously I didn't feel white, but my siblings used to make fun of me because they used to say that I used to talk white because I talked properly. And that was really tough for me. Sort of not knowing then what the heck I was, because I wasn't all the way Dominican, and I wasn't African American, I wasn't Black, and obviously I wasn't white. So I always had that sort of identity crisis throughout high school specifically. Then once I went to college, and in college I majored in peace and justice studies and in French. So I definitely got a wider global perspective while I was in college, and I studied abroad. I left the country for the very first time and went to France and spent 6 months there and studied French and studied geopolitics and Arabic. So now I'm like in France with like Algerian best friends, and like went to Morocco. So I'm then now building this very global identity. And I think that that's where I am now. Being able to bring to the DR when I moved back here in 2005, being able to bring that global identity that I created in college and that I created while studying abroad really helped me navigate the feeling of not necessarily belonging here either in the beginning, because I wasn't Dominican enough necessarily when I first came here, because I had a lot of like gringo is what they call it, like a lot of gringo habits. And, I speak Spanish very well now. But when I got here, I never had like an accent necessarily, but I would say all these things like the wrong way. So having that global perspective helps me navigate my own identity between being American and being Dominican, because I consider myself a global citizen, and I do definitely identify myself as a woman of color and a Black woman and an Afro-Latina. But for me, those identities come secondary to this feeling of belonging very much anywhere I go,
Yeah. Did you have that feeling, which I've had as an Indian American, that it's like I'm too Indian to be American, but I'm too American to be Indian? Like it's that kind of.
Absolutely. And I was like, what the hell's going on? Like, then where do I belong? And then as soon as I realized that I do not need to belong to one group or the other, that was a very liberating experience. And it's funny that you're asking this question now, because this is something that I don't even think about anymore. But then, remembering on when I used to think about it, it was excruciating, feeling like I didn't belong anywhere. And it's funny because, a lot of times people ask me, what would you tell your 16-year-old self? Or what would you tell your 20-year-old self? And now that I'm 31, and I'm like, well, I would tell her not to worry about belonging to any kind of ethnicity or nationality or whatever, because it's just so freeing to feel like you could just land anywhere in the world and feel a sense of belonging if you construct that and if you build that. You know what I mean? I lived in France for 6 months, and you couldn't tell me that I wasn't French. I bought my Longchamp bag. I started going to the gym there. I started volunteering at a bakery. I was like, I learned all the names of the different breads. I mean, you couldn't tell me I wasn't French.
Yeah.
So it's a weird feeling to feel like you could really belong wherever you choose to belong.
Yeah, I think they call us third culture kids who kind of have created this third culture that's between two places. But I think, as you're saying, even that's a bit of a misnomer, because we're not really third. We're kind of just creating this whole definition of what it even means to belong to a culture.
Right. And I think that belonging to a culture is one thing and identity is something else. And my identity is definitely that of a Black woman, that of a woman who is a descendant of enslaved people who were so resilient to be able to have me be a product of what they went through. And I hold that really dear to my heart. But that's just one part of me. That's not necessarily going to dictate how I function necessarily around the world,
Yeah, totally. So can you tell us a little bit about the work that you do?
Yes, of course. So I went to college for French and for peace and justice studies. And peace and justice studies is this major that's composed of like sociology and theology and philosophy and politics. It's kind of all these things. And essentially what I wanted to do with that degree, I wanted to get a law degree, and then I wanted to go to the Middle East and solve all the problems in the Middle East. That was what I wanted to do at one point. And then I realized that after going to a photography internship in Dubai, right after I graduated from college, I remember I had read that summer The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde by Junot Diaz. And all these things from that book that, he mentions all these things about the Dominican Republic, they kind of sat in the back of my head, in my subconscious. And while I was in Dubai, I was like, Jesus Christ, I've only been to the DR once my entire life, and I call myself Dominican. I can't be Dominican if I don't know how to tell people how to get around the country and whatever. So all these things in my head pushed me to come back to the DR for just 2 months. I wanted to come back for 2 months so that I could get to know the country and really call myself a Dominican. And those 2 months turned, like I said before, into nearly 9 years. So when I came here, I started doing, my money ran out after 2 months, of course. And then I had to get a job, and I got a job in public health. So I worked in public health, specifically in HIV prevention amongst sex workers and men who had sex with men here in the Dominican Republic. And I did that for about almost 4 years. And in the process of doing all that and being in the Dominican Republic, I realized that I needed to finally let my curly hair grow out and cut all of my relaxed hair, because it was just too hot here. And it was, I would always want to go to the beach and stuff. And I just couldn't handle having to go to the hair salon to straighten my hair. But most importantly, I realized that I wanted to embrace all of me. And that for me is also an act of self-love and self-care, embracing who I was fully. And so in 2010, I decided to cut all of my hair, all of my straight hair and chemical relaxed hair. And I left my hair grow out curly. And what happened after that is that I was being stopped in the streets by all these women who were like, how did you do that? How did you get to curl like that? Oh my God, you're so brave. And then I decided to create MissRizos.com, which is a blog that celebrates and educates and promotes curly hair. And I never in a million years imagined that I would be doing this full time and that it would grow to the extent that it's grown. But it did. And, I did this space to answer these questions for Dominican women. And it turns out that women all over Latin America were also hungry to learn more about their hair, to learn more about themselves. And Miss Rizos has grown from, 25 followers on social media to almost 100,000. And I've traveled to over 8 countries to basically talk about how to care for your hair, but most importantly, how to love yourself the way you are. In 2014, finally, I did decide to open a salon to help sustain everything that I was doing, because we also do lots of workshops and work with young girls surrounding self-esteem and surrounding natural hair care. And so Miss Rizos Salon has now been open for about 3.5 years. And that's what I do. That's my job. I run a salon. I'm an social entrepreneur, businesswoman, activist, public speaker. And I'm in the business of self-love, essentially, for sure.
So that's really both amazing and interesting and exciting. Do you think that on this podcast, especially in season 1, we talked a lot about community care, and it sounds like your salon is really a hub of community care, and the work that you're doing is about that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that's a really beautiful term. I've never actually heard it before. So how do we move from self-care to community care? And I think that Miss Rizos Salon does just that. Miss Rizos Salon is a space that you go in, and you don't just go in to get your hair curled or get your hair washed and cut or trimmed, whatever. It's a place that you go in and you seek the acceptance and the validation of others in a positive way. Because I don't think that we should go on every day seeking acceptance and validation from people. But in terms of this issue, particularly when it comes to something that's been shunned by society for years, and something that's deemed as unprofessional and unkempt and ugly by society, you do need a hub or a group of people or a community that teaches you that that's not true. And I think the salon does that. So it's a transfer of validation, is a transfer of acceptance, and it's a transfer of self-love from the stylist and the staff at the salon and the visitors, from one end to the other. It's like a two-way street, and there's definitely a whole lot of community love happening there.
For people who kind of don't understand the complicated relationship some of us have with our hair, can you talk us through a little bit of the history and the origins of that, and why hair can be such a big deal for certain groups of people and really tied to identity, and why that affirmation is necessary? For sure.
I'll talk specifically about how that manifested in the Dominican Republic. You can imagine that all over Latin America and even the US, it has a similar story, but not exactly what I'm going to tell you now.
Sure.
But essentially, the Dominican Republic, also known as the island of Hispaniola, where supposedly, Christopher Columbus came and quote unquote discovered America. We were an island that had lots of enslaved Africans. And that's part of the identity of Haiti and of the Dominican Republic. As almost everyone should know, there were colonizers here, and the colonizers were from France and from Spain and a little bit from Portugal. And these folks were white, and these folks had the power, and these folks governed the entire island, and it was this way for many, many years. I think that there was this idea from the very inception of this island that in order for you to have power, in order for you to be beautiful, in order for you to be on the top of society, you had to obviously look a certain way. And I think we've dragged that all the way to today, and these things have been kept into place by the governments of the Dominican Republic, specifically Trujillo, who was our dictator for decades, who hated anything that was Black, and who tried to do a whole erasure of the entire idea of being Black. So he even started switching up the terms to identify your skin color here. So for me, when I first came here, and thank God this has changed since I've been here. But when I first got here, my skin color, and I'm a dark person, I'm a brown person. My skin color was Indian. Indian is not a skin color. And this man, this dictator, in an attempt to erase Blackness, he created the color for skin: cinnamon, dark cinnamon. I don't know how to the exact translation, but trigueño, indio, etc., etc. So all of these terms, in order to not use the term Black, essentially. So you can imagine that if your dictator is saying that this is bad, and you've already had this deeply rooted idea of what's beautiful and what's ugly, what's rich and what's poor, what's worthy, what's not worthy. And it's been very clearly, differentiated that the Black is ugly, the Black is poor, and the white is beautiful, and the white is rich. Then there's just so many factors that are going to lead you to believe that, in fact, when you're born and your hair is curly and your skin is dark and your nose is wide and your lips are big, then you were born with a terrible situation, you were born broken right out of the factory. You know what I mean? And therefore you have to fix yourself. If you're broken, you have to fix yourself. And how do you fix yourself? Well, you bleach your skin, and you straighten your hair, and you dress differently, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that's what we've been doing for years and years and years. And we continue to do that today. And I think that this curly hair, natural hair movement is very different from the Black is Beautiful movement in the 60s, 70s, because I really do think that this is something that's here to stay. And I think that what we're trying to do is really transform and really and rewrite history and rewrite the rules of what is beautiful and what is not. And I think as soon as you give people the power to define beauty on their own terms, then I think that's it. You know what I mean? Then we start getting rid of these ideas of what is beautiful and what isn't. I have this article I wrote a few years ago on the blog where it was like the perfect curl. And it was like one of those bait titles for a blog post, and people were all so excited. They go in and they're reading about the perfect curl. And when I tell them the perfect curl is your curl, that's exactly what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to teach women and men and children that they get to decide, they get to define their own beauty, and that their hair is the most beautiful because it's their hair. And that's what we're doing.
Have you seen any resistance to this?
Of course, there's always going to be resistance, but it's so, this is a question I get asked a lot. And it's so funny because I would say there's been maybe 2% resistance and 98% acceptance. And it's one of the biggest blessings for me, and one of the things that makes my job so much more interesting and enjoyable and rewarding. It is insane how much support I've gotten in this country with this movement, from the press, the media, from the government even. I've worked with the Ministry of Youth, I've worked with the Ministry of Commerce. People just find this fascinating. People just find this really necessary and cool. And one of the things that has helped me a lot with this project is that I always have kept it a very cute, modern, sassy, hip type of project while I'm teaching something that's very heavy. So our social media is always cool and bright, and our approach is always earthy, but it's just we're doing activism in a different way. We're talking about Blackness, but we don't say Blackness. So the way I think the approach that I've been able to give to this movement, or at least to this project particularly, because I don't want to speak for the entire movement, it's in a way so that people can enjoy it, and so in a way so that people could relate to it. And I think that has helped me tremendously in getting everyone to the table and getting everybody kind of interested and listening and wanting to read more and wanting to find out more, even if they don't have curly hair by nature. So I have a lot of followers who have straight natural hair and who just find this fascinating and who want to support in some way. And I think that that's so beautiful, because in order to have this change permanently, we need everyone to support this idea that curly hair is beautiful and curly hair is professional.
So I think some folks, and I don't know, but I want to just kind of be inclusive, that some folks might be surprised to think about a place like the Dominican Republic, which people think of as, I guess, Central American, Latin American country, as having a population of folks who are Black. And I think the idea of like Afro-Latino is like a relatively new concept for a lot of kind of Americans. And I was wondering if you could you talked about it some, about the history of enslaved people in the Dominican Republic, but if you could also just talk about how like Afro-Latino is a thing, and those are real people.
You know what's so interesting, and this is the first time I've thought about it in this way. I mean, talk about how crazy it is that people didn't know that Cuba, Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, and tons of other places in Latin America were either predominantly Black or had a large population of Black people. Talk about how crazy that is, that we were literally erased. I mean, we were a non-factor, erased, we were literally not on the map for millions of people, for the world. And that goes to show the oppression and the lack of everything that Afro-Latinos experience if they are a group of people that for years have been erased from the map. Dominican Republic is 80%, at least 80%. A lot of people argue 92. 80% Afro-descendant. That's like the entire island. You know what I mean? So is, Cuba. And people think that Cubans are not Black. And Colombia has I think 36 population is Afro-Latino. And then Uruguay, Paraguay, which are tiny little countries, have pockets of Afro-Latinidad. Honduras and El Salvador. And Mexico has tons of Afro-Latinos. So we're all over Latin America. And the fact that people didn't know that we existed is a huge problem. It's a huge problem.
Because you have.
Because we're there, because we're human beings and we've existed this entire time and people didn't even see us, again, there's so many particularities within each country, but talk about Mexico. The Afro-Latinos in Mexico, holy cow, there's an amazing documentary on YouTube about it, where basically they weren't even counted in the census, and a lot of times they would be stopped by the police in the middle of the street, and they would want to take them to a border somewhere because they would tell them that they didn't belong in Mexico because they didn't see them as a Mexican. So it's so troubling. I mean, it's so troubling what's happened and what continues to happen with the Afro-Latino community all over Latin America and the world.
Yeah. So can you tell us, I don't know, some stories about your experience as you've developed Miss Rizos, as people have responded to it, particularly amongst the youth? What have you experienced? What have you seen? And also, I think hair is such an interesting thing, both because of how tied it is to our identities, but also because a lot of times you can't do your hair by yourself. So it's almost necessarily a form of community care that you almost have to do it together. And so I'm wondering if you can talk about your experiences with that.
So I think that you can definitely do it by yourself. You just have to learn. And the community part comes in teaching people how to care for their hair. Yeah, so many things. So, starting with maybe some of the negative things, one day I was with a group of friends and we were out in the colonial zone where the salon is now. And we wanted to have some drinks at this really cool bar. And once we got to the door, the bouncer, who looked just like me, said that we couldn't go in because of our hair. So that's something that still happens in the DR. Not as often, but definitely still a reality. So there are those reactions from people. But then there's all these other reactions from young people and from all sorts, from all ages, really. I can't say that I've gotten more reaction from young people than from older folks. I feel like it's been a crazy experience to see all the reactions from all different ages and sexes too. So most recent reaction was from this group of students, fifth graders, I believe, in San Antonio, Texas. They saw a video about Miss Rizos, and they read a magazine that I was featured in for Scholastic. And they asked their professor that they wanted, or the teacher that they wanted to do a video and send it to me. So they sent it via Instagram. And mind you, these are like maybe 6 or 7 students with straight hair. And they were just like, yo amo mi pajón, which means I love my curly hair. And they said that in the video. And I posted it. And after posting it, the students who are on Instagram started writing me and telling me how much they love the project. And I thought that was so special to have a group of students who didn't even have curly hair fall in love with this project, because I think that it inspires them to also fight for whatever cause is dear to their hearts, using maybe some of the techniques that I use with Miss Rizos. You know what I mean? So if they want to fight for immigration laws or for environmentalist laws or whatever, that they could do it in a way that's fun, informative, like we do with Miss Rizos. And then when I'm traveling, I also get all these different stories from people. One in particular that I always like to tell is from this woman. Her name is Rosie. She's in her mid or late 40s in Colombia. When I went to Cartagena, and we were doing introduction, she gets up and she's like, "Hi, I'm Rosie, and I just want to let you know that I traveled all the way from El Choco." And mind you, I wasn't up on my Colombia geography, but she made sure to tell me I took 2 planes to get here, So she came from far, and she took 2 flights to get there. And apparently after this session, I found out that El Choco is one of the poorest parts and one of the blackest parts of Colombia, and it's in the north, and I was in Cartagena in the south. And Rosie wanted to come all the way from El Choco to tell me that she started her coconut oil company inspired by my own entrepreneurial journey. And she wanted to come and say this to my face and to show me her coconut oil and to tell me how the work that we're doing with Miss Rizos has transformed her.
That's just such an interesting and fascinating story. It must be so gratifying for you to know that your work is having an impact on such a broad community of people.
Absolutely. And I always say that as activists, a lot of times we don't get to see the results of the work that we do, because a lot of times the change happens after we're gone. When you think of Martin Luther King or Malcolm X, when you think of Sojourner Truth or, W.B. Du Bois, like all these people who fought against injustices, they didn't get to really see what happened after, fully. And I feel like we're living in a world, because of social media and because of globalization, we are able to see things happen a little faster. And I feel very grateful that I get to see these things. I don't know how the activists did it, back then, when they just had to keep fighting constantly without seeing a whole lot of progress. I feel very privileged to be able to see so much progress as I'm working on this, because it's not easy to do.
Yeah. How has the way, now that you're kind of leading in this space, I'm sure you still have your insecurities and uncertainties. And how does the fact that you're leading the space change the way you think about it?
Oh my God. So I have so many insecurities, and it's insane. So I'm very transparent about these things, because a lot of times when we see people on social media, or when we hear about people's work or whatever, we kind of start sort of creating these idols and these superheroes. And, at the end of the day, we're all just human beings who are always making mistakes and who have to deal with all the stuff inside. And I'm constantly talking about this stuff, because it's really important for me to tell people that we can't let those feelings of insecurities paralyze us, because they're always going to be there. So, for example, this is really funny, right? So I do public speaking engagements, every so often, not all the time, because I am very busy at the salon. But every time I do one, I'm like, what am I going to talk about? Like, can I even talk?
Yeah.
The imposter syndrome of like, what gives me the right to talk about this stuff, So that's an insecurity that I deal with all the time, public speaking, and knowing that, yes, I do have really important things to say. But it's really funny, because a lot of people don't think that, I'm afraid to sometimes speak about what I do. And yeah, and you know, and then there's also obviously like just more maybe superficial insecurities. They're not as prevalent, they're not as loud, but they're there. You know, sometimes I might wake up and feel like I'm a little overweight or whatever, but they're not, thankfully, they're not necessarily that loud, but they're there and they can, you know, come up and in any moment of my week or my month or whatever. But yeah, I don't know. It's like, I feel like these past few years, there's so much that has happened to me, so many, you know, tough situations with work and with people, and every one of those sort of mistakes or every one of those barriers that I'm able to cross, I use that as strength and I use that as a lesson. And I don't always feel that way in the moment, but I definitely more often than not do feel that way about the things that happen to me. You know, I try to be a very positive person. And even with like heartbreaks, you know, I'm not like, oh, forget all men, or I hate men, or I'm never going to be able to find someone without, like, I'm, you know, after a heartbreak, it hurts. I cry. I feel freaking terrible. But then I'm like, okay, what did I learn from that relationship? What am I not looking for? What am I looking for? And I just take those lessons and I move on, you know, and that's how I see life.
What you're describing, I think people talk about as being a growth mindset, that you're kind of like, life is not fixed, right? You can always change, you can always grow, and you can always learn. And one of the things I would, as we close out the episode, I'd love to hear from you is what is, you kind of described that you're working on these things, but I'd love to know, what is one self-care habit that you're currently working on developing more fully?
Sleep. Oh my God. So today's Sunday, right? And after this call, I have to finish a few things and I have to go to work. I work today on this Sunday at the salon, and I worked yesterday and I worked the day before yesterday, and I haven't been getting a lot of sleep. And sleep is so important because sleep helps you make better decisions. Sleep helps you re-energize and feel fresher and be able to deliver better in every aspect. And I need to work on making sure that I'm sleeping enough, and that, you know, that is an act of self-care. And I was recently reading a post that my friend shared, and she was saying how self-care is almost like a political act. Yes. And I totally agree. You have to take care of yourself. You have to replenish. You have to re-energize. You have to love yourself. I've always said this about self-love specifically. You have to love yourself and learn how to love yourself so that you could teach others how to love you, so that you could be in better relationships, both friendships and romantically. So sleep for me is an act of self-love, and I need to work on getting more sleep, essentially.
Yes, it is. And it is just also just for your health. Like, we are human people who need to sleep to just function.
to survive.
Yes. Well, thank you so much for joining us for this episode. I certainly learned a lot. I'm sure our audience did as well. And this was just a really interesting perspective and way about thinking of things. So as we close out the episode, I would like to thank our listeners for listening to another episode of Self-Care Sundays. And before we wrap up, I want to give a special shout out to our patrons on Patreon. Their generosity makes our show possible and are a huge reason why you're hearing the episode today. We're especially grateful for the support of our super contributors, Vicky B, Rainu J, Brady K, Bill S, and Embershot. If you'd like to support the show and hear your name at the end of our episodes, please check out patreon.com/Self-Care Sundays podcast. Again, that's patreon.com/Self-Care Sundays podcast, and give us a follow on Twitter at Self-Care Sundays and on Facebook at Self-Care Sundays. Carolina, do you have any social media handles where people can follow you?
Yes, absolutely. So you can follow me on Instagram, where I'm most active at Miss, like Miss Universe, MISS, _Rizos, and Rizos means curls, and it's spelled RIZOS. So Miss_Rizos on Instagram and Twitter, and Miss Rizos on Facebook. And if you'd like to learn a little bit more about our salon in Santo Domingo, you can follow us all over social media as Miss Rizos Salon.
Yes, and everyone should, because the content is amazing.
Thank you.
I'd like to thank the person who made our show art, Leah Horowitz, and the amazing artist who made our music, For Real City. On behalf of our producer, Jess Alwar, our communications interns, who are new this week, Kennedy Freeman and Sophie Gomez, our audio engineer, Kato Zane, and myself, thank you for tuning in today, and we'll see you on our next episode.